Morning, everybody. So this passage of the Canaanite woman, very intriguing story that on the one hand contains great moments of faith and on the other raises our eyebrow. There are questions that emerge. Did it really matter that the woman was not one of the children of Israel? Why does Matthew make it a point to mention her ethnicity, that she was Canaanite? Why does Jesus not answer her the first time? And it is obvious in verse 23 that she kept pestering Jesus, and at least the disciples, because the disciples asked Jesus to send her away. Why do the disciples ask Jesus to send her away? The dialogue between Jesus and the woman also reveal moments that make us question the universal nature of God's saving plan. Was Jesus indeed only sent to the lost house of Israel, as he claims? Is it fitting that Jesus say to the woman, "It is not right to take the food of the children and throw it to dogs"? Even today, this would be a very demeaning statement. Now, the answers to these questions depend on understanding the way and the purpose in which Matthew has composed the story. Primarily, why? First of all, let's take it as a personal story. In other words, here is a one-on-one conversation between Jesus and a helpless woman. It's a story of great faith, understood. It still leaves us with the question about the separation of children and dogs. And that is what compels us to move to Matthew's greater purpose in writing the story. Really, folks, this story is a social commentary of the church and the society of the time. This story that Matthew is composing is really about Jewish-Gentile relationship in the early Christian church. In the past, before Jesus came, there were Jews who we know from history, the history of salvation, that God chose them for a purpose and a reason. So there was the Jewish people, and there were the Gentiles. Along came Christianity, along came Jesus Christ, and of course, his own people rejected him, and yet there is the acceptance of Jesus going on in the Gentile world. So there were Jews in the past and there were Gentiles, and along comes Christianity that was trying to accommodate both the Jews and the Gentiles. But how? Ethnic reconciliation, or national reconciliation, or racial reconciliation, these are complex tasks. So we think about the time when in the 1862 to 65, when the Civil War and slavery ends, right? Well, that's great. Even today, America hasn't figured out how to bring two races together. How long has it been? And so the whole idea of Christianity coming in and trying to bring Jews and Gentiles together into one faith perhaps is as complex a task as we trying to figure out in America the reconciliation between whites and blacks. Now, Israel has a role in all of this, in God's plan of salvation. Matthew's community, which is primarily a Jewish community, has to figure out how do they reconcile their election as God's people with the new people that are coming in. Because the way history of salvation is played out, Israel is chosen by God not because they were superior in any way. God did not choose Israel because they were racially, ethnically, economically, or any way superior. In fact, they were a slave people. Why did God choose Israel? Because they were insignificant. And the larger reason was, it was through Israel that the rest of the nations would come to know God. In other words, the relationship between God and Israel and how Israel conducted its affairs in the world was meant to attract the rest of the world, not to Israel, but to God. However, God's election of Israel does not rule everyone else out. In fact, the story is that the rest of the people also have a place on God's table, but they will come because they'll be attracted by how Israel conducts herself in relation to God and to the people, rather than God compelling and forcing everybody to come. Now, Matthew tries to affirm this for the sake of the Jewish community, and that's what's going on in the story. When Matthew puts in Jesus' mouth, the words, "I was sent to the lost children of Israel," what is Matthew doing? He's trying to tell the Jewish people that their election as God's people is still valid. When Matthew separates the children versus the dogs, in many ways, he's trying to tell the community that that separation perhaps does not function anymore. Rather, Gentile people are welcome into the church. In fact, the reality is that the Gentile people were showing more faith than the Jewish people. And so really, Matthew is affirming the place for Jews and Gentiles in the banquet that Christ would throw for all people. God's plan of salvation is meant for all. However, if Israel does not play its role as the light to the nations, then there is a problem. Practical implication for us today. God has chosen both as individuals, each one of us, and as the church, as God chose Israel. God chose Israel. God chose the people who form the church today. God has chosen you and I. Why? Not because we are superior. Not because we are children and others are dogs. No. Rather, to be a light to the nations. The church must be a light to the nations. Your life and mine must be a light to people, so that people may look at how we conduct our affairs, not only with God, but with one another, and say, well, I would like to be part of you. Because of us, people must be drawn to Christ, just like this Canaanite woman was drawn to God because of Christ. So Christ functions in a dual role over here. On the one hand, he represents God. On the other, he represents humanity or Israel. People must look at our lives and find it so attractive, so beautiful, so affirming, so faith-filled, that finally they come to know Christ and God through us. This is our baptismal call. May we be the light that Christ wants us to be. May people find in our lives a way to come to Christ himself. Amen.